question is what happened with the treatment that Paul DePascal got. In any case, dealing with subject matters of copyright infringement, I guess he was not successful, even though we are all convinced, I speak for myself, that they took everything that happened from this movie except they converted it. And by the conversion, I mean, in the movie, the women kill the men. In real life, according to the state, the men kill the women. It's, you kill my wife, I'll kill your wife. That was a scenario, actually, it was a scenario on True Detective magazine at one time on the front cover. And it was about this case that came in Hoboken. In addition, there were many similarities that made it interesting. They changed the name, which was, of course, it happened in Hoboken, at least one homicide, and they changed it to Bayonne in the movie. And eventually, Harvey Keitel gets the final, confession, but in reality, it was my client going down numerous times to the prosecutor's office in the early stages and giving different explanations. And then finally, in the last half hour, he gave one and they returned an indictment.
You mentioned that you, in that case, had the opportunity to cross-examine somebody who was later to be the prosecutor of Hudson County. It's my understanding you've also had some other unusual cross-examinations, and I think in your career you had one case where you wound up cross-examining your father?
Yes. It was a murder case, and actually he was an assistant county medical examiner, and it was before Judge Duffy. And I was cross-examining. Of course, the jury did not know that we were related. Everything wasn't disclosed totally. If it wasn't asked for, it wasn't, it seemed like a lot of things weren't disclosed. And Judge Duffy thought that I was being too difficult with my father, too rough on my father,
How'd your father feel about it?
I personally think he enjoyed it. He enjoyed this unusual circumstance. It was like one time I was able to tell my father, I said, well, I discovered a body in a case before you saw the body that weekend. And that was a case that eventually Judge Hanrahan was the first assistant. And it was a case where I received a call and led me to call a police officer who I knew, a detective. And I said, I have reason to believe that there may be a body up in this particular address. And he and I and someone else, if I recall, went up to the place on the boulevard, and an individual was in the room. He was under a sheet, and there was an arrow through the sheet into him. And so I did see the body before my father saw it.
With respect to that particular case, what was the outcome of that?
The outcome was the individual was declared not guilty by reason of insanity.
Now, you talked about that the defense bar in criminal law when you started was, 3 or 4 people in Hudson County. What did the prosecutor's office look like back then?
Well, it was much smaller. Probably in 1959, I would say, there were under 8 assistant prosecutors. There were only, my recollection is, that there were only 3 judges handling criminal cases, and they all were being handled in the Brennan Courthouse. There was Judge Duffy, who sits where Judge Costello sits now, where I tried my first case. There was Judge Graff, and there was Judge Reeves. And there were no other judges hearing it. Of course, you never knew whether something humorous was going to occur, and amongst all the seriousness that you were involved.
What do you
But
recall?
I can always remember one of the funny situations. I was trying a murder case before Judge Graff. Judge Graff happened to have a hearing problem. And we came back and he was going to charge the jury. And he proceeded to charge the jury. I stood up, he told me to sit down, so I sat down. And I got up again and sat down again. And he finished his whole instruction to the jury in the murder case. And then we went over to the sidebar for what the objections were. I said, Judge, no one has taken this down because the court reporter wasn't there. And the court reporter was a guy named Sam Fisher, who lived up in St. John's at the time. And he went home.
St. John's Apartments in
St.
Jersey.
John's Apartments in Jersey City. And he went home and he was asleep. So they had to send the sheriff's department up to get him. And I said, that was the reason I was trying to tell you that there was nobody who was taking this down.
Along that line, I'd like to try to touch on something. You indicated that when Judge Graff said, sit down, you sat down. And I would think that that was your style and your philosophy in practicing law. Have you seen that style be contagious with your fellow practitioners, or now is that style a different style? Not for you, but for the people you see around you.
No, I think that the individual people had their own style. There could be, people who kept talking after the judge made a decision, then and now. I think it was part of the personality. I don't mean to say that you were ever less adversarial back when I began practicing. I think that was part of the nature of it. I think you didn't get personal. And I don't think that most people practicing law today bring a personal animosity or feeling against the other lawyer. I'd say that would apply then, would apply now, but in the process, because the numbers of people participating in this have increased. So there is more opportunity for some individuals to be different in terms of how they approach things. But for the most part, I see civility the same on a different scale as it was back then. And there are always going to be people who lack it and forget that they're just representing a client. And at the end of the game, even if they don't believe in shaking the hand of their adversary, you at least walk away without thinking that somebody's tried to fool you. Not that that never happened. It did happen, and it does make you angry, but you have to contain your anger.
So you would say, by and large, this civility between, and the professionalism between the people in the criminal bench, or bar, I should say, is pretty much the same as it always been from the time you started practicing?
Yeah, I think it is. I think just there is a certain sense of competition that has come about with the expansion of numbers. More cases, more judges hearing criminal cases, more calendars that get extended, more crimes that haven't been committed, more mandatory sentences of prison, which is taken away from somewhat from judicial independence, even when a judge wishes, you know. That's been good in some respects, but bad in others.
With respect to what other areas have the practice changed over the past 45, 50 years?
I can tell you, when I did matrimonial to the extent that I did, by going in on uncontested divorces, that situation was going in with 3 files, literally, that would occupy, you know, such a limited space in a Redwell. Today everything is statistical. You never knew, you know, what the judicial position was going to be on, let's say, support, alimony. You didn't know. It was going to be up to a judge to determine that. Today, so much of this is placed into computers, and it spills out all of the information, and basically the judge probably goes along with it. And I don't do any matrimonial work anymore. I've always said that the most difficult cases that I always tried, they would fall into a category. The most difficult being contested custody or adoption cases. I tried a contested custody case, and it was also a contested adoption case. And it involved a mother and a grandmother. And there was no question but that the child would have been better off with the grandmother, because the daughter had too many problems. It went on for about 6 or 7 days, and very contentious. At the conclusion, it wasn't, because after everybody so-called pulling each other, the mother and the grandmother came to a decision, and the child stayed with the grandmother, and I was representing the mother. And I could tell you that, in my opinion anyway, that was the best that could happen to that child. And I used to get cards from both the mother. Around the holiday, I get a card from the mother and the grandmother. So that was the worst. The next group that was the worst were contested estate cases, where you have siblings fighting over money. That became very animous. I had cases where I had daughter suing father's estate, you know, brother suing brother. It's always been very contentious. I always said at the bottom of the list, after you got through divorce cases too, and I never really had any significant contested divorce cases. That was taken over later on by Steve Schaefer, who was a judge here and who was our partner. And then, of course, Kara for the last 30 years. You know, and they were expert at these things. But then at the bottom of the list, I always said were homicides. You know, you basically never received, at least I never received any, you know, letters saying you did this wrong or that often go with the flow. So I considered that they were less involved to the extent of becoming emotional with their lawyer.
With respect to, you're mentioning about family law cases becoming more complicated, more difficult, more paper. Has that been true of the criminal practice over the years?
Overall, I would say the criminal law has not been overwrought with paper. That doesn't mean you don't have occasions where you're dealing with wiretaps, you're dealing with certain types of frauds. You don't have generally the same degree of paperwork. And for the most part, some of the same issues that existed back 50 years ago are the same issues that dealt with probably 50 years before that, and still are dealt with today in a criminal case. If the issues are what the police said, what reports they made, what notes they didn't keep, there's still that. If the issue is the identification of someone, that's the same old, except it's been almost codified by a recent decision. But the juries were always making those independent decisions. So the introduction of drugs certainly increased another issue, so that the issue when it came to drugs was not so much the expertise on, is this a drug, a controlled dangerous substance, or is it not? The issue really usually turns on, how did you get there? Did you have probable cause to stop that car? Did you have probable cause to go and conduct a search and things like that? So the constitutional aspects that did exist before just have had more opportunities to sort of play out.
One thing I'm a little curious about that you mentioned that there probably was about 3 or 4 lawyers in Hudson County who did criminal work, and that there were maybe 5 or 6 assistant prosecutors handling the state's case. Now, the city of Jersey City has a population, I would think, similar now to what it was back then. And people looking at this may really scratch their head and say, how could the criminal system operate with so few people, where now, I guess there's probably about 50 people in the prosecutor's office, and you have the public defender, and you have, as you indicated, an awful lot of lawyers now practicing, many of whom may be practicing criminal law. How is that able to be taken care of?
Well, the increase in the number of designated crimes, the increase in mandatory penal sentences and confinements on the things that were left for discussion with a judge at the time of, let's say, sentencing, may be going to trial now that never would have gone to trial before, even though percentage-wise, probably the same percentage ends up in trial, but because of the numbers, they turned out differently. The people could handle it before because that's how many cases there were. Each judge might have had his own calendar. That was basically the way it always worked in the criminal section, that each judge had his own calendar or her own calendar, up to a point. And at one point they tried to have a assignment judge for the calling the calendar, and that did not work out very well, even when there were less judges assigned to it. So they eliminated that. And although there's a criminal assignment judge now, it's not the same as that judge, Judge Venable, for instance, calling the calendar on every single case.
With respect to the calendar, back when you started, were criminal cases have a big backlog, or did they get
Yeah,
major?
they did. That's one of the reasons I was able to get as much trial experience as I did, was because criminal cases, my uncle had so many criminal cases, and so many of these criminal cases that I was trying before a jury today would end up back in the municipal court.
With respect to the backlog now, is there a backlog similar or different from what it was when you started?
Yeah, there are more in number. There are more in number of cases in the backlog, but percentage-wise it's probably the same, and maybe it's even reduced.
You've tried an awful lot of cases, and I would imagine in that 400 or 500 number of cases. As you indicated, there were a lot of murder cases. Basically, what's been your philosophy, and what have you learned appearing before so many jurors as to prepare to convey your position to a jury?
Well, I always believe that you have to express yourself to a jury, and that might have been easier when you were able to ask the questions back at the beginning, rather than the judge asking the question.
You mean
But
picking,
you-
selecting the jury?
Yes, in the selection process of the jury. But you have to make a connection with that jury that convinces them that you're being honest, you're being candid about the position that you're taking, and that by the time the case is ready to go to summation, that you have brought out things that are going to raise questions in ordinary people's mind. And that's what you try to do. You try to be candid, you try to convey to them that these inconsistencies mean something rather than they're meaningless. Because as we all know, there are many inconsistencies that are meaningless, but there are many that are significant. And you always have to try to concentrate on the most significant one that will become believable to 12 people. And that in and of itself is a factor that you have to convince 12 people of that same position, which, you know, in a civil case you don't.
Now, you were able to garner that skill and experience as a result of trying many cases, starting when you walked into the door of your Uncle Abe's office. That's not true now, is it?
No, today, if you eliminate the public defender's office and you eliminate the prosecutor's office, then you are going to have people who are going into private practice, and let's say going in with some other person or persons, they're going to have less opportunity to try cases. And that certainly is true not just in criminal, it's true in the civil cases. It's so often that I've heard young lawyers saying that, you know, they haven't tried a case and they've been practicing for 3 years. You know, unless you never wanted to try a case, unless you never wanted to try a case, you know, you would have gotten the opportunity to try cases, even if they turned out to be before a jury, even if they turned out to be cases that today they wouldn't indict the individual.
You mentioned earlier about your partner Jerry writing the book on criminal law. Jerry is a relative of yours, isn't he not?
Yes, he is.
And I'm just curious and you've been together for how many years?
Well, Jerry's been there, I guess, 44. So, in addition, we also grew up in the same house.
And how is it having a family practice, so to speak, with somebody you've known since, I guess, teenage years or adolescent years?
Well, I can't say how it would be for somebody else, because they often say that the business is not necessarily good when you're dealing with relatives. But Jerry definitely is proof of the exact opposite. I couldn't have a finer partner, and it's not because we're doing it, it's just because that's the case. He's brilliant in my mind, and he's pragmatic, and he's down to earth. And that's the way he always was, and that's the way he is.
Never any competition?
Never once. Never once.
It seems
in
like
my whole life.
Looking back at it, given, you know, your education, your experience, your success, is there a reason why you decided to stay in Hudson County, work in Hudson County, be associated with Hudson County, as opposed to going some other place that might be more, not rewarding, but more financially successful or closer to home or something like that?
No, I never had any desire to go any other place. I never gave any thought to going with a large law firm. And there was some large ones, even though Hudson County, I consider small law firms for the most part. Certainly 90+% of people under 5 or 6 lawyers, definitely under that, many single practitioners. Because, first of all, Hudson County has a history in my family. My grandfather came to Jersey City in the latter part of the 19th century. They opened up a bar, and also they shoed horses down on Grand Street, down at the bottom of Fairmount Avenue. I would be there every single Sunday of my life. That was my mother's father. I'm saying my father always wanted to go every single Sunday, but that was literally just about every single Sunday. And I was connected to seeing my grandfather, and my grandmother happened to be sick, but her sister lived in the house, and so she was a dominating force, my Aunt Pauline. So that was where my mother was born in 1905. My father was born on Central Avenue, March 19th, 1900. So all my roots, even though I grew up in West New York, were from Jersey City. My father went to Dickinson High, then he spent a year in the Army in the First World War, and everything connected with the family was in Jersey City, or where we were in North Hudson. And to me, my uncle, being the very gregarious person that he was, had a great influence on coming to Hudson County, offering a job, and after all, when he offered me the job, I was already married. I already had, one child, another one on the way. They were my oldest son and daughter were born in August, one day apart, one on August 29th and one on August 30th. It would have almost